The heat shimmered in waves off the cracked alkali flats, and the air inside the New Mexico trading post smelled of dust, cured leather, and sun-baked creosote. Jonas Hale stood at the counter, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, the limp in his right leg, more a memory in his posture than a visible impediment. He had placed his list on the worn plank wood, flour, cartridges, coffee, and a small block of salt. Nothing more. At 39, Jonas carried the frontier in the lines around his eyes and the quiet set of his jaw. A former Army scout, he had learned the hard economy of words and movements, and he spent them both sparingly. The proprietor, a balding man named Elias, with a stained apron and weary eyes, was weighing the flour when the doors burst open, slamming against the interior walls. The lazy afternoon stillness shattered. Two men, their faces flushed with sun and self-importance, strode in. They wore the tarnished silver star of deputy sheriffs, but they moved with the swagger of hired muscle their authority borrowed from the man who paid them. Between them, they dragged a young woman, her wrists bound tightly with a rawhide strip. She was Apache, her dark hair a tangled mess, a fresh bruise purpling her cheek. Her dress, made of simple calico, was torn at the shoulder. She stumbled, her bare feet scuffing the dusty floorboards, but her chin remained high, her eyes burning with a defiant fire that seemed to enrage her captors. "Caught the little thief, Elias." The larger deputy announced, his voice a gravelly boast. He shoved the woman forward, red-handed, trying to sneak off Silas Blackwood's property. Elias stopped his work, his gaze flicking nervously from the woman to the deputies. What did she take? His missus's silver locket. "The one he keeps on the mantel," the second deputy chimed in, a weaselly man with shifty eyes. "Found it right in her gathering bag." He shook a small deerskin pouch, and its contents spilled onto the floor. Dried herbs, a piece of flint, and a small, intricately carved bird fell out scattering in the dust, and with them a silver locket on a delicate chain. It slid across the floor, catching the light from the doorway, and came to a stop against the toe of Jonas's worn leather boot. The world seemed to fall silent. The low hum of flies, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the nervous breathing of the proprietor, it all faded away. Jonas bent down slowly, his knee protesting, and picked up the locket. His fingers, calloused and scarred, closed around the cool metal. It was oval-shaped with a single perfectly etched hummingbird on its surface, its wings caught in mid-flight. He didn't have to open it. He knew what was inside. A wave of memory, cold and sharp as a winter river, washed over him. He saw a field of wildflowers under a Montana sky. He saw Sarah, her laughter like the chime of a bell, her hand reaching up to touch the very same locket at her throat. A wedding gift. He had carved the hummingbird himself, a clumsy but heartfelt effort. He saw the fire, the smoke, the silence that came after. The small wooden crosses on a lonely hill. His hand tightened around the locket, the delicate edges pressing into his palm. This wasn't just a similar piece of jewelry. It was an exact replica, a ghost made of silver. "Give that here," the large deputy grunted, reaching for it. Jonas didn't look up. He remained crouched, his gaze fixed on the impossible object in his hand. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "This isn't hers." He looked at the Apache woman then. Her name was Naya, though he did not know it yet. Her eyes met his wide with a flicker of confusion and fear. She had no idea why this quiet, limping stranger was defending her, but she saw something in his face, a deep, unyielding sorrow that seemed to recognize her own. Jonas rose to his full height, the locket still clenched in his fist. The deputies took an involuntary step back, suddenly faced with a man who was no longer just another quiet drifter in a dust coat. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a flinty hardness, the calm of a man who had seen the worst of the world and was no longer afraid of it. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the locket was a lie. And in that moment, a decision was made. He wasn't just buying supplies anymore. He was taking a stand. The larger deputy, whose name was Cobb, puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his authority. It was in her bag. That's all the proof we need. Now hand it over, Drifter. Jonas's gaze remained fixed, his expression unreadable. A hummingbird, he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the tense silence of the trading post, with a broken wingtip on the right side, and a small scratch just below the eye. I carved it myself a long time ago. He held up the locket. This one's perfect. Too perfect. It's a copy. The proprietor, Elias, leaned forward, his eyes wide. The other customers in the store, a pair of prospectors and a farmer's wife, froze in place. Cobb's face darkened with frustration. What kind of nonsense is that you saying Blackwood is lying? I'm saying this woman didn't steal that locket. Jonas stated his tone, leaving no room for argument. He opened his fist, offering the locket not to the deputies, but to the Apache woman. Did you? Her eyes darted from his face to the silver in his palm. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. A single word escaped her lips, raspy and raw. No. Before Cobb could respond, the doors to the trading post swung open again. The man who entered was the antithesis of his thuggish deputies. Silas Blackwood was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored black coat. His silver hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. He moved with an unhurried grace that commanded attention, his eyes a pale, cold blue, taking in the scene with an air of detached amusement. He was the owner of the largest ranch in the territory, the man who held the town's debts and its loyalties in his manicured hands. A disagreement, gentlemen. Blackwood's voice was smooth-cultured and laced with a subtle venom. He glided past his deputies, his gaze settling on Jonas. He smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. I don't believe we've met. I am Silas Blackwood. Jonas Hale, Jonas replied, his voice still low. Blackwood's eyes flickered to the locket in Jonas's hand, and then to the Apache woman. Ah, yes. The stolen item. A piece of great sentimental value. My deputies were just returning it. He extended a hand. If you would be so kind. I believe there's been a mistake, Jonas said, not moving. This locket is a replica. The real one had flaws. Blackwood's smile did not waver, but a dangerous glint entered his eyes. An interesting observation, Mr. Hale. You seem to know a great deal about a locket you've never seen. I know the man who made the original Jonas, said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A heavy silence descended. Blackwood studied Jonas for a long moment, his head tilted. It was a look of assessment, like a hawk sizing up its prey. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating. Finally, he gave a soft, dismissive chuckle. Perhaps you are mistaken, Blackwood said smoothly. Regardless, the item was found in her possession on my land. This town values order, Mr. Hale. That woman is a disruption, and I do not tolerate disruptions. His gaze shifted to the woman, and the mask of civility slipped, revealing a flash of pure contempt. She will be dealt with, according to our laws. What law says you throw a woman in a dry well for a crime she didn't commit? Jonas's voice was a low growl. The deputies flinched. They hadn't told Blackwood their intended method of justice. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You are new here, Mr. Hale. I suggest you learn your place before you find yourself in a position you cannot walk away from. The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in silk, but delivered with the force of a hammer. For a moment, Jonas considered it. He could drop the locket, turn around, and ride out of town. He could leave the woman to her fate and return to the quiet solitude that had been his shield for so long. He saw his wife's face in his mind, heard her voice telling him he had a good heart. He had tried to bury that heart with her, but it was still beating. He looked at the Apache woman, at the raw hope struggling against the terror in her eyes. He couldn't walk away. Not again. He slipped the locket into his own pocket. She's with me. He said the two words, a declaration of war. He turned to the woman. "Let's go." He placed a steadying hand on her arm. Cobb moved to block him, but a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture from Blackwood stopped him. Silas Blackwood watched them, his face a mask of cold fury, his thin smile gone. He had intended a simple, brutal lesson for a trespasser. Instead, this quiet, limping stranger had turned it into a public challenge. As Jonas led the woman out of the trading post, the townsfolk parted before them, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Jonas untied his horse, his movements calm and deliberate. He lifted the woman onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, ignoring the burning protest from his wounded leg. He took the reins and began to lead the horse out of town, not looking back. He didn't need to. He could feel Silas Blackwood's eyes on him, a cold promise of retribution that would follow them into the hills. The plan to be gone before the town noticed him was in ruins. Now the whole town was watching. The trail leading away from the settlement was steep and rocky, a dry wash that cut a winding path into the barren hills. Jonas walked with a steady, ground-eating stride, his hand firm on the horse's reins, his back to the town that now considered him an enemy. The woman Nia sat slumped in the saddle, her body swaying with the horse's gait. She clutched the worn horn with her good hand, her injured arm held tight against her ribs. Each jolt sent a tremor of pain through her, but she remained silent, her breathing shallow and controlled. Jonas didn't look at her, but he was acutely aware of her presence. The light weight of her in his saddle, the faint scent of sage and fear that clung to her, the sheer stubborn resilience that kept her upright when she should have collapsed. He had seen that look before in the eyes of soldiers who refused to die, in the faces of survivors who had lost everything but the will to draw another breath. As the last of the ramshackle buildings disappeared behind a rise, he allowed himself a glance back. No one was following. Not yet. Blackwood was a patient man, a predator, who preferred to let his prey exhaust itself before closing in. The thought sent a cold knot tightening in Jonas's gut. This wasn't over. It had barely begun. The sun beat down, leaching the color from the landscape until everything was a uniform shade of bleached brown and pale green. The air was still and heavy. Jonas's thoughts churned with the events at the trading post. The locket. It was a deliberate cruelty, a detail too specific to be a coincidence. Had Blackwood known, had he somehow learned of Jonas's past, of Sarah, it seemed impossible. He was a stranger here. But the doubt lingered, a poisonous seed planted in his mind. He stopped once where a trickle of water seeped from a rock face to let the horse drink. He offered his canteen to Nia. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. When she handed it back, their eyes met for a long moment. Hers were filled with questions she didn't dare ask. Why him? Why risk everything for a stranger, an Apache? He had no easy answers for her. Heard voices before and didn't answer, he'd once thought. Now, staring into her dark, searching eyes, he knew it was simpler and more complicated than that. He saw the ghost of his own family's vulnerability in her. He saw the casual cruelty he had witnessed and fought against his entire life. Helping her was not a choice. It was a reflex, an action as ingrained as breathing. "My name is Nia," she said, her voice a low murmur, the first words she had spoken voluntarily. Jonas, he replied his own name, sounding foreign on his tongue after so long in self-imposed silence. He continued on, leading them deeper into the maze of canyons and mesas that he knew from his scouting days. He sought a place that was defensible with water and cover a small box-ended canyon with a spring-fed creek and a thicket of cottonwoods. By the time they reached it, the sun was a fiery orange sinking behind the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of violet and rose. He helped her down from the horse, his hands gently spanning her waist. She was lighter than she looked, her body frail beneath the torn dress. She swayed on her feet, and he steadied her, his grip firm on her good arm. For a moment she leaned against him, a brief surrender to the exhaustion and pain that radiated through her. Then she straightened her pride, reasserting itself, and stepped back. Jonas said nothing. He unsaddled the horse, then set about making a camp with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done so 1,000 times. He built a small, smokeless fire in a pit, shielded by rocks, its flames invisible from more than a few yards away. He laid out his bedroll near the warmth and filled a tin pot with water from the spring. He turned his attention to her arm. "Let me see," he said, his tone gentle but firm. She hesitated, her ingrained distrust warring with the undeniable throb of pain. He waited patient. Finally, she nodded, unwrapping the crude rawhide that bound her. Her left arm was swollen and grotesquely discolored at the elbow, the joint twisted at an unnatural angle. Jonas's stomach tightened. It was dislocated, possibly fractured. "This will hurt," he warned, his voice low. She clenched her jaw, her eyes locking onto his. "Do it." His hands were surprisingly gentle as he probed the injury. Then, with a swift, practiced motion, he pulled and twisted. A sharp crack echoed in the quiet canyon, and Nia cried out a strangled gasp of agony that she quickly bit back. Her body went limp, and she sagged against him, sweat beading on her forehead. He held her for a moment, letting her catch her breath before carefully examining the joint again. It was back in place. He tore strips from a spare shirt in his saddlebag, fashioning a clean, functional sling. As he worked, binding her arm securely against her body, his fingers brushed against the warm skin of her neck. She flinched, not from pain, but from the unexpected intimacy of the touch. He paused, his hands hovering for a second before completing his task with detached professionalism. When he was done, he handed her a cup of hot, bitter coffee. She took it with her good hand, her fingers trembling slightly. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the sharp line of her cheekbones, the deep bruise on her temple, and the fierce intelligence in her eyes. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the creek. The wall of suspicion between them had begun to crumble, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. He had not just rescued her. He had treated her with a respect she had not known from any white man. "The locket," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the flames. "They said I stole it. I went to Blackwood's ranch to ask for work or scraps. His wife. She used to be kind before she got sick. But he turned me away. The next morning his men came for me. They said the locket was missing from the mantle, and they found a copy of it in my bag. It was planted," Jonas stated. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "I never saw it before they pulled it out." "But why go to such trouble to frame me?" Jonas looked out into the darkness that had gathered beyond the firelight. He thought of the perfect replica of Blackwood's cold, calculating eyes. "It wasn't about you," he said slowly, the pieces beginning to click into place in his mind. "It was a trap, and I walked right into it." Nia looked at him confused. "A trap for you, but he does not know you." "He does now," Jonas said grimly. The feeling that this was personal, that the locket was a message aimed directly at him, grew stronger. He didn't know how, but Silas Blackwood was connected to his past. The town, the stolen item, Nia herself, they were all just pieces on a board, and he was the target. The realization did not bring fear, but a cold, familiar anger. He had spent years running from the ghosts of his past. Now it seemed one of them had finally caught up. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile peace forged in the isolation of the canyon. Jonas taught Nia how to set snares, his movements economical, as he showed her how to fashion a loop from wire and place it on a rabbit run. She was a quick study, her hands, though limited to one, deft and sure. In turn, she showed him which roots were edible digging them from the hard-packed earth with a sharpened stick, and how to read the subtle signs of the desert, a bent twig, a disturbed patch of sand, that he had not known. They were two survivors each, with their own set of skills, their knowledge meshing to create a functional whole. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer born of mistrust. It was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the small sounds of their shared existence, the scrape of a knife on wood. As Jonas carved a splint for her arm and the soft hum of Nia's voice, as she sang a low, mournful song of her people. The crackle of the fire, that was their hearth. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle, she came and sat across from him. She had been watching him for some time, her gaze thoughtful. "You were a soldier," she stated, her voice soft. He paused, running an oiled cloth over the rifle's steel barrel. "A scout," he corrected her quietly. "Long ago. You carry the war with you," she said, her eyes drifting to the slight, almost imperceptible way he favored his right leg. "Here." She tapped her own temple. "And here." Jonas stopped his work and looked at her. Her perception was unnerving. She saw the things he had spent years trying to hide. He gave a slow, somber nod. "Some things you don't leave behind, I know," she whispered. And in those two words, he heard the echo of her own losses, her scattered tribe, her lost family, the life that had been stolen from her. It was a bond of shared grief, a common language of pain that needed no further translation. He found himself telling her about Sarah and about their infant son Daniel. He spoke of their small homestead in Montana, of the smell of pine and the endless sky. He did not speak of how they died, not yet. The memory was a wound still too raw to touch. But he spoke of their life, and in doing so he felt a part of himself long dormant stir to wakefulness. Nia listened, her expression compassionate, her presence a silent testament to his pain. When he fell silent, his voice thick with unshed tears, she reached out with her good hand and rested it on his arm. The touch was light, hesitant, but it anchored him, pulling him back from the precipice of his grief. Her arm was healing. The swelling subsided, the angry purple fading to a mottled yellow. He checked the splint daily, his touch gentle, professional. But a new awareness had grown between them. He felt the warmth of her skin beneath his fingers, saw the way her breath hitched when he leaned close. He found himself watching her as she moved about the camp, admiring the quiet grace in her movements, the unyielding strength in her spirit. The peace was shattered on the 5th day. Jonas was returning from checking his snares, 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder, when he heard the distinct sound of a shod horse picking its way down the canyon trail. He froze, melting back into the shadows of the junipers. His hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip. A single rider emerged into the clearing. It was Silas Blackwood. He was alone, riding a magnificent black stallion that seemed out of place in the rugged terrain. He sat in the saddle with an arrogant ease, his expensive coat unbuttoned, his pale blue eyes scanning the camp. He saw Nia by the fire, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Good morning," he called out, his voice echoing in the canyon. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." Nia scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with alarm. She looked toward the trees where Jonas was hidden, a silent plea in her gaze. Jonas stepped out from his cover, the rabbits dropping to the ground. He held his rifle loosely in his hands, its muzzle pointed toward the dirt, but his stance was coiled ready. "Blackwood, you're a long way from home." Blackwood's smile widened. He dismounted, leaving the stallion's reins to hang loose. He knew his horse would not stray. He walked forward with that same unhurried confidence, stopping a dozen paces from Jonas. "I came for a conversation, Mr. Hale. Or should I say Sergeant Hale?" Jonas's blood ran cold. "Yes, I know who you are." Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Jonas Hale, formerly of the 3rd Cavalry, a decorated scout, a hero, some might say, though not everyone would agree." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You don't remember Lieutenant Miller, do you, Sergeant, a young man, fresh from the East, full of romantic notions about the frontier? He served under your command. Jonas's mind reeled. He remembered Miller. A good kid but green, too eager to prove himself. He had died in an ambush near the Powder River, an Apache raid. Jonas had been the sole survivor, found unconscious under a pile of his own men. I remember him, Jonas said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Excellent, Blackwood purred, because I remember him too. He was my younger brother. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The canyon, the creek, the sky, it all blurred. The ambush wasn't a random act of violence in a long-forgotten war. It was the epicenter of this new nightmare. His letters were full of tales about you. Sergeant Blackwood went on, his voice hardening, the veneer of civility cracking to reveal the raw hatred beneath. The legendary Jonas Hale, who knew the land better than the natives themselves. The man who could lead his troop through hell and back. But you didn't, did you? You led them into a trap. And when the fighting started, you ran. You abandoned them. You left my brother to die butchered while you saved your own skin. That's a lie, Jonas snarled, his knuckles white on the rifle. Is it? Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You were the only one to walk away. That's all the proof I need. I've spent years searching for you, Hale. Years planning this. I learned all about you. About your wife, Sarah. About the locket you carved for her. My brother described it in his last letter. A beautiful piece. It wasn't hard to have a copy made. The final piece clicked into place. The locket wasn't a coincidence. It was a summons. The accusation against Nia was a pretext, a carefully crafted piece of theater designed to draw him out, to force him into a confrontation. Nia was just bait. Jonas said, his voice flat with dawning horror. A convenient bit of kindling to start the fire. Blackwood agreed with a dismissive wave. Her fate is of no consequence to me. This is about you and the debt you owe. A life for a life. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a fanatical zeal. I'm not just going to kill you, Hale. That would be too quick, too merciful. I'm going to strip away everything you have, just as you did to me. I'm going to make you watch as this woman, this savage you've decided to protect, is torn apart by the very town you defied. I'm going to turn you into a hunted animal. And when you have nothing left, when you are broken and alone, then I will grant you the release of death. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with fluid grace. He looked down at Jonas, his face a mask of triumphant loathing. There is a bounty on your head now, Sergeant. $500. For the coward who murdered a woman and fled justice. Every man in that town will be hunting you. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He wheeled the stallion around and galloped away, the sound of its hooves a fading drumbeat of doom. Jonas stood frozen and the rifle heavy in his hands, the weight of his past crashing down on him with the force of an avalanche. He was no longer just a man protecting a wronged woman. He was a ghost haunted by a vengeful spirit who would not rest until he was destroyed. He looked at Nia, who stood pale and trembling by the fire, and knew with sickening certainty that he had not saved her. He had damned her. The canyon that had been their sanctuary was now a trap. Blackwood's chilling promise echoed in the sudden silence. Every man in town would be hunting them. Jonas's mind, honed by years of survival, immediately began calculating angles, escape routes, and odds. They were all impossibly slim. We have to move, he said, his voice grim. He kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing the last wisp of smoke. Now, Nia nodded, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. The fear was there, a shadow in their depths, but it was overshadowed by a fierce determination. She would not be a helpless victim. She packed their meager supplies, the remaining flour, the salt, the tin cups into a saddlebag with swift, economical movements of her good arm. Jonas saddled the horse, his hands working with a speed born of urgency. Every sound, the rustle of a leaf and the call of a bird, was magnified a potential threat. He scanned the canyon rim, expecting to see the glint of a rifle barrel at any moment. He will have told them which way we went. Nia said, her voice low and steady. They will come from the town, which means we go deeper into the Badlands. Jonas finished swinging the saddlebag into place, where the horses can't easily follow. He helped her onto the horse, then took the reins, leading them away from the creek and up a steep, treacherous game trail that clawed its way up the side of the canyon. The path was narrow, littered with loose shale that slid and tumbled under the horses' hooves, the sound dangerously loud in the quiet air. For hours they traveled, pushing eastward away from the settlement and into the labyrinth of twisted rock and thorny scrub that stretched for 100 miles. The sun climbed high, beating down with a merciless intensity. There was no water here, no shade. It was a desolate, forgotten corner of the world, and it was their only hope. By late afternoon, the horse was faltering its breath, coming in ragged gasps. Jonas knew they had to abandon it. He unsaddled the animal, smacking it on the rump and sending it back the way they had come. It was a decoy, a false trail for their pursuers to follow. He slung the saddlebags and his rifle over his own shoulders, the weight settling heavily on him. He passed the canteen to Nia. Drink sparingly, he instructed. We don't know when we'll find more. They continued on foot, Jonas breaking the trail, his limp more pronounced now, under the heavy load. Nia followed close behind her steps, surprisingly light and sure-footed on the uneven ground. Her knowledge of the wilderness began to reveal itself. She pointed out a sheltered overhang where they could rest, hidden from view. She found a handful of bitter berries that eased their thirst, warning him away from a similar-looking plant that was poisonous. Her world was this harsh landscape, and in it, she was no longer the helpless woman he had pulled from the well. She was a survivor. As dusk fell, they found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the base of a towering mesa. They ate a cold meal of dried meat and hardtacked their hunger, a dull ache in their stomachs. They were fugitives, hunted and alone. Yet in the shared hardship, a new, deeper bond was forming between them. This is my fault, Jonas said, his voice rough with guilt as he stared out at the star-dusted sky. I brought this on you. Nia turned to him, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. You did not put the locket in my bag, she said, her voice firm. You did not throw me in the well. Blackwood did those things. This fight is with him. You chose to stand with me. I choose to stand with you. Her words were a balm to his raw conscience. He had expected fear or blame. Instead, she offered solidarity. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a liability, but a partner. Her resilience was a match for his own. He finally told her the truth of the ambush at Powder River. He spoke of the blinding flash of the attack, the chaos, the screams of his men. He told her how he had taken a blow to the head and woken up hours later the sole survivor in a field of slaughter. He hadn't run. He had been left for dead. But the guilt of being the only one to live had been a heavier burden than any lie Blackwood could concoct. I should have died with them. He whispered the confession torn from a place deep inside him he had kept locked for years. To die is easy, Nia said softly, her hand finding his in the darkness. To live is the hard part. You lived. That is not a coward's choice. Her fingers intertwined with his, her touch warm and grounding. In the desolate heart of the Badlands, with a bounty on his head and enemies closing in, Jonas Hale felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a decade hope. The next day they saw their pursuers. A posse of 12 riders, tiny figures moving across the valley floor below them. They were following the horses' tracks, just as Jonas had intended. But it had only bought them a little time. Sooner or later the hunters would realize their mistake and cast a wider net. For 2 more days, They pushed on their water running dangerously low, their bodies aching with fatigue. The chase was a relentless, silent pressure. They saw the posse again closer this time and were forced to spend a sweltering afternoon hidden in a narrow crevice, the rock hot enough to burn their skin, while the riders passed less than 100 yards away. The tension was suffocating. On the third day, the sandstorm hit. It began as a dark line on the horizon, a smudge of brown against the blue sky. Jonas had seen them before. They were violent, unpredictable, and deadly. "We need shelter," he yelled over the rising howl of the wind. A real cave, something deep. The wind was a physical force, now tearing at them, whipping sand into their faces until it felt like 1,000 tiny needles. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging dust. It was Naya who found it. She tugged on his arm, pointing toward a dark slit in a rock face he had overlooked. It was barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it opened up into a larger cavern, a pocket of stillness in the heart of the storm. They collapsed inside, coughing, their throats raw, their eyes streaming. The roar of the storm was a dull thunder outside the darkness in the cave absolute. For a long time, they just lay there listening to the fury of the elements, grateful for the simple fact of being alive. The storm raged for a full day. Trapped in the dark, they were forced to confront their dwindling resources. They had a handful of flour left and less than a cup of water in the canteen. They were weak from hunger and dehydration. "We can't stay here," Jonas said, his voice raspy. "The posse will be scattered by the storm, but they'll regroup. We're trapped." "The storm is an opportunity," Nia countered, her voice surprisingly strong. "It erases our tracks. It will force the hunters back to the town for shelter. It gives us a chance." A chance for what? Jonas asked, a note of despair creeping into his voice. "To starve in this cave." "No," she said. "A chance to stop running. We go back." Jonas stared at where he presumed she was, in the darkness, stunned. "Back to town, they'll kill us on sight. They will expect us to run farther into the desert," she argued, her logic sharp and clear. "They will not expect us to walk back into the heart of their power. We can find water, food. We can find a way to fight back. Hiding out here, we will die. In the town, we at least have a chance." He knew she was right. It was a desperate, insane gamble, but it was better than the slow, certain death that awaited them in the Badlands. The storm that had seemed like a curse was now their only shield. Under its cover, they could slip back into the town that wanted them dead and confront the man who had orchestrated their destruction. It was a choice between two kinds of death. They chose the one that let them fight. Under the cloak of the raging sandstorm, the town was a ghost of itself. Buildings were hazy apparitions in the swirling brown gloom. The wind shrieked through the alleys, carrying a fine, gritty dust that seeped through every crack and crevice. The streets were deserted, every soul having taken refuge from the elemental fury. It was this chaos that Jonas and Nia slipped into two phantoms moving through the storm. They were gaunt, and their clothes tattered, their faces masked with a layer of grime. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and thirst was a fire in their throats. They made their way to the back of the trading post, where Jonas knew Elias kept a rain barrel. It was nearly full, the storm having driven what little moisture there was in the air into its basin. They drank deeply, the cool water a shock to their systems, then refilled their canteen. Their goal was the saloon. It was the largest, most fortified building in town, a place where people would gather to wait out the storm. It was also the heart of Blackwood's power, the unofficial seat of his authority. It was the last place anyone would expect them to go. They slipped in through a back door used for deliveries, entering a small, cluttered storeroom that smelled of stale beer and sawdust. The noise from the main room was a low murmur of voices, muffled by the howling wind outside. Jonas put a finger to his lips, and Nia nodded. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the small space. He peered through a crack in the door. The saloon was crowded. Townsfolk, prospectors, and a few of Blackwood's ranch hands were huddled at tables, their faces illuminated by the flickering yellow light of swinging lanterns. And at the bar holding court was Silas Blackwood himself. With him were his two deputies, Cobb and the weasel-faced man, along with the town sheriff, a portly, complacent man named Abernathy, who had always struck Jonas as more of a functionary than a lawman. Jonas felt Nia's hand on his arm. He looked at her. Her eyes were clear, her expression calm. They were in this together to the end. He gave a short, sharp nod. He kicked the door open and stepped into the room. A collective gasp went through the saloon. Conversations died. Men froze with glasses halfway to their lips. All eyes turned to the apparition in the doorway. The haggard, dust-caked man with a revolver held steady in his hand, and the Apache woman standing just behind him, her gaze as fierce as his. Blackwood was the first to recover. He turned on his bar stool, a look of genuine surprise on his face, which was quickly replaced by a cold, predatory smile. Well, he drawled, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. The ghost of Sergeant Hale. I must confess, I didn't expect you to be so eager for your own demise. This ends tonight. Blackwood Jonas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He took a step forward, Nia moving with him, a seamless shadow. Sheriff Abernathy, flustered, finally found his voice. Hale, you're under arrest for murder and everything else. He fumbled for his pistol, his hand shaking. The only murderer in this room is him. Jonas said, his gun never wavering from Blackwood's chest. He framed this woman. He put a bounty on an innocent man. He lied to all of you. A nervous murmur went through the crowd. Some of the townsfolk looked uncertain, their eyes shifting from Jonas to the powerful landowner who controlled their livelihoods. Blackwood laughed, a condescending, dismissive sound. Desperate words from a desperate man. A coward who abandoned his men. I never abandoned anyone. Jonas countered, his voice ringing with a conviction that gave the lie to Blackwood's accusation. I woke up the lone survivor of an ambush your brother was too green to see coming. I've lived with that. But I won't live with your lies. The tension in the room was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, each second a hammer blow, counting down to violence. The lantern swayed wildly as the wind battered the building, casting long, dancing shadows that made the scene even more surreal. Blackwood, seeing that Jonas's words were having an effect, decided to change the game. With a sudden snake-like movement, he grabbed the saloon owner's young son, a boy of about 10 who had been hiding behind the bar. He yanked the child in front of him, pressing the muzzle of a derringer to his temple. The boy cried out, his face white with terror. Enough of this, Blackwood snarled, his mask of civility gone, completely revealing the rabid animal beneath. You want a duel, Hale? You'll have one. Drop your weapon or the boy dies. Then we settle this man to man. The saloon owner cried out, No, please, Mr. Blackwood. Jonas's gut clenched. The stakes had just been raised to an unbearable level. He was trapped. If he shot, the boy would die. If he dropped his gun, Blackwood would kill him without a second thought. His eyes met Nia's. He saw a flicker of an idea in her gaze, a silent communication that passed between them in an instant. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod. All right, Blackwood. Jonas said, slowly lowering his revolver. You win. He bent down as if to place the gun on the floor. At that exact moment, Nia acted. With her good arm, she grabbed a heavy whiskey bottle from a nearby table and hurled it with all her might at the largest lantern hanging over the bar. The glass shattered and burning oil splashed across the wooden bar top. Flames erupted instantly, creating a wall of fire and thick, choking smoke. The crowd screamed and surged back. In the ensuing chaos, Jonas dove to the side, rolling behind an overturned table. Blackwood, momentarily blinded by the flash and smoke, shoved the boy away and fired his derringer into the spot where Jonas had been standing. The shot went wide. "Kill him!" Blackwood shrieked at his men. Cobb and the other deputy drew their guns, firing wildly into the smoke. Jonas returned fire from behind his cover, one shot carefully aimed. Cobb grunted and fell clutching his shoulder. Then came the final betrayal. Sheriff Abernathy, who had been shouting for order, raised his own pistol. But he didn't aim it at Blackwood's remaining man. He aimed it directly at Jonas's cover. "It's over," Hale the sheriff yelled, his face a mask of panicked greed. "The bounty is mine." He fired the bullet, splintering the wood of the table inches from Jonas's head. The twist was complete. The law itself was on Blackwood's payroll. Jonas was fighting on two fronts, trapped between the fire and the guns of his enemies. The saloon, once a place of refuge, had become his tomb. The saloon was a vision of hell. Acrid smoke filled the air, burning eyes and choking lungs. Flames licked up the wall behind the bar, casting a demonic flickering light on the scene of chaos. The townsfolk were screaming, scrambling for the exits, trampling one another in their panic to escape the inferno. Jonas was pinned down. Abernathy and Blackwood's remaining deputy had him trapped, their bullets chewing through his flimsy wooden cover. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. He fired back sparingly, making each shot count, but it was a losing battle. Through the smoke, he saw Naya. She hadn't run. She was crouched near the far wall, her face grim with determination. She caught his eye and pointed toward the flaming bar. Jonas didn't understand at first. Then he saw it, a rack of heavy beer barrels stacked against the wall. He gave her a sharp nod. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. He laid down a volley of covering fire, forcing Abernathy and the deputy to duck back. It was the opening Naya needed. She scrambled across the floor, staying low, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline, shoved the top barrel with her good shoulder. It teetered for a moment, then crashed to the floor, followed by two more. They rolled across the uneven floorboards, gathering momentum, heading directly for the sheriff and his cohort. Abernathy looked up, his eyes wide with panic, just as the first barrel slammed into his legs, sweeping him off his feet. The second one crashed into the other deputy, sending him sprawling. Jonas didn't hesitate. He rose from his cover and fired twice. One shot disarmed the deputy. The second struck Sheriff Abernathy squarely in the chest. The corrupt lawman collapsed, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. Suddenly, a figure loomed out of the smoke. It was Blackwood. His fine clothes were singed, his face blackened with soot, his eyes burning with pure, murderous rage. He lunged at Jonas, not with a gun, but with a primal fury, tackling him to the ground. The two men rolled across the floor, a tangle of limbs and grunts of effort. Blackwood was stronger, fueled by years of simmering hatred. His hands closed around Jonas's throat, squeezing, cutting off his air. Jonas's vision began to swim, black spots dancing at the edges. His revolver had been knocked from his grasp. He scrabbled at Blackwood's face, his fingers finding the man's eyes. Blackwood roared in pain, and his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Jonas heaved, using his legs to throw the larger man off him. He staggered to his feet, gasping for air, just as Blackwood came at him again, this time with a shard of broken bottle clutched in his fist. Jonas sidestepped the wild slash, the jagged glass, missing his face by an inch. He brought the heel of his boot down hard on Blackwood's instep. The man howled and stumbled. Jonas followed through with a brutal punch to the jaw that sent Blackwood crashing backward into a table, which splintered under his weight. Blackwood lay there, stunned at the fight knocked out of him. The fire was roaring now, consuming the back of the saloon. The roof groaned, threatening to collapse. Nia was at Jonas's side, tugging at his arm. "Jonas, we have to go." He looked down at the defeated man and the architect of his pain, the source of a vendetta that had nearly cost them everything. He could end it right here. One more bullet. But as he looked at Blackwood's pathetic, gasping form, he felt no triumph, only a vast, hollow emptiness. Killing him now would solve nothing. It would only feed the cycle of violence that had consumed his life for too long. He turned away. "Let him burn," he said, his voice cold. He grabbed Naya's hand, and together they fought their way through the smoke and confusion toward the main doors. As they burst out into the street, the sandstorm was beginning to subside, the wind's shriek lessening to a mournful moan. The townsfolk were gathered at a safe distance, their faces pale and shocked as they watched their saloon burn. They saw Jonas and Nia emerge, and they parted a silent sea of awe and fear. Jonas felt a sharp, searing pain in his side. He looked down and saw dark stains spreading across his shirt. In the chaos of the fight, he hadn't even realized he'd been shot. His legs buckled, and he fell to one knee. Nia was there instantly, her arm supporting him. Jonas, she tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound, her movements urgent but steady. The roles were reversed. He was the wounded one now, and she was his rock, his strength. The townspeople watched, their expressions unreadable, as the Apache woman they had condemned tended to the wounds of the man who had fought for her. The fire crackled and roared behind them, a funeral pyre for Silas Blackwood's reign of tyranny. The storm was ending, and in its wake, nothing would be the same. A week later, the town of Redemption was quiet. The skeleton of the burned-out saloon stood as a stark monument to the night of the storm. Silas Blackwood had not been found in the ashes. He had apparently escaped the fire, a disgraced and broken man, who had vanished into the territory, his power shattered. Sheriff Abernathy was buried in a plain pine box, his treachery a subject of hushed whispers among the townsfolk. Jonas was healing. The bullet had passed clean through his side, a painful but not a mortal wound. He and Naya had taken shelter in the small back room of Elias's trading post. The proprietor, his conscience finally outweighing his fear, had offered them sanctuary. Others in the town had followed his lead, leaving anonymous gifts of food-clean bandages and even a new coat for Jonas on their doorstep, small tokens of gratitude and apology. Nia tended to his wound with a gentle, practiced hand. She cleaned it, dressed it, and brought him broth to keep up his strength. As he lay on a simple cot watching her move about the small room, he saw the full circle of their journey. He had pulled her from a well, a broken and helpless victim. Now she was his caretaker, her spirit whole and stronger than ever. Their bond, forged in desperation and violence, had been tempered into something unbreakable. On the seventh day, when Jonas was steady enough on his feet, he knew what he had to do. He and Nia walked to the small windswept cemetery at the edge of town. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue, the air clean and crisp. He led her to two simple wooden crosses that stood side by side on a small rise overlooking the desert. The names carved into them were fated by sun and time, Sarah Hale and Daniel Hale. Jonas stood before the graves, his hat in his hands. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the replica that had started it all. For a long moment, he just held it, the metal warm in his palm. It was a symbol of his grief, a relic of a life he could never reclaim. With a deep breath, he knelt down and placed the locket on the mound of earth at the base of Sarah's cross. It was an act of release, a final painful letting go of the guilt and sorrow he had carried for so long. He turned to Naya, his voice low and clear. "There was an ambush," he said, finally telling her the last part of the story. "My patrol was escorting settlers. We were outnumbered. I told Miller Blackwood's brother to fall back to get the women and children to safety while we held them off. But he was young and proud. He charged. I went after him." He paused, the memory sharp as glass. "I was knocked unconscious. When I woke up, they were all gone. I wasn't a hero who survived. I was just the one who was lucky enough to get hit on the head instead of through the heart. I've carried that luck like a curse." He had finally said it aloud. The truth stripped of glory and lies. He felt the immense weight lift from his shoulders. Nia listened, her dark eyes full of a profound understanding. She reached into the small pouch at her waist and took out a small, smooth stone, intricately carved, with the symbol of an eagle in flight. It was an Apache token of safe passage, of a new beginning. She knelt beside him and placed the stone on the grave of his son next to the locket. It was a gesture that transcended words, a merging of their pasts, a promise for their future. They didn't belong in this town with its ghosts and painful memories. They had found each other here, but their life lay elsewhere. As they walked away from the cemetery, Jonas's limp seemed less pronounced, his shoulders straighter. The next morning, they rode out of town. Elias had given them a sturdy pack mule and enough supplies for a month. The townsfolk watched them go, their silent gazes, a mixture of respect and regret. Jonas and Nia didn't look back. They rode east toward the rising sun, the vast, open horizon, a canvas for a future they would build together. They were not fugitives, nor were they heroes. They were simply two survivors who had found in each other a reason to live, riding, not away from a painful past, but toward a shared horizon, their bond forged in fire and sealed by choice.